Welcome back to another episode of the Testudo Talk podcast. As always, I'm Emmett Siegel here with Andrew Chodes. Now that we have a little bit of time after the Maryland men's basketball season has ended, we've had a little bit of movement in the offseason. It's officially underway with the transfer portal and everything else going on in this time of year in college basketball. First off, Andrew, it's been a bit since we've been on the show here, and it's been a busy week or two since the season ended for Kevin Willard and such. Um, I guess let's start with before we get into some of the additions. Let's start with potentially maybe the most important news of the offseason so far is that Julian Reese is coming back for his senior year for Maryland. There were a lot of rumors that after a second straight honorable mention all conference selection and success he's had, and given the way that two of his three seasons have gone, that Reese was going to test the waters elsewhere. But he made the announcement earlier this week that he will be coming back to College Park. Obviously, a huge addition, not necessarily a huge addition, I should say, but avoiding a huge subtraction. Maryland did. Andrew, to start off, first reactions to when you saw the news about Reese, and just what does this mean to Maryland? As they embark on this offseason, which will be a very important one for Kevin Willard.
Yeah, no, I think it's massively good news for Kevin Willard and the rest of the staff. I mean, with Zach Edey gone next year for Purdue, I don't think it's crazy to say that Julian Reese is probably right now he's the best returning big man in the Big Ten. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of shifting in the transfer portal, and we don't know who's going to return for other teams. But I mean, Julian Reese, he's a back-to-back, all conference player. He averaged almost a double-double. We know how important he is to this team, and I think you can look directly at that last game of the season against Penn State where they didn't really have an interior presence and they got absolutely decimated. And, he really established himself as a leader, especially towards the end of the season. And I think he's an invaluable piece to the Terps for next year.
Absolutely. I think Julian Reese will undoubtedly be the team's most recognizable, best returning player coming into next season. And, what that provides, just even outside of what he provides on the court. I got an email from the team, promoting that he's coming back, trying to sell tickets, stuff like that. Just, year over year, when nowadays you don't have a lot of continuity on
Yeah.
college basketball rosters, to have a guy like that, a Baltimore guy coming back for his fourth year, and knowing how important he is to the team, I think is huge. And then, on the court, obviously his impact is really unmatched by anyone else that's going to be coming back to the team this coming year. What he does in the post, we'll see maybe if he can extend his game a little bit farther out to the perimeter. He hasn't really done so in 3 years, so you're not necessarily expecting him to, step into some role of a knockdown 3-point shooter or anything like that. But definitely a guy that, you're excited to see what he can do as a senior, given the jumps you've seen over the course of his career.
Yeah, and if I can kind of touch on that as well, you mentioned the continuity, and there's already almost 1,100 players, in the transfer portal, and to see a guy stay with the team for 4 years, you don't really see that often in college basketball anymore, and especially for a guy that's gone through two really tough seasons. Obviously, he's been through three coaches, a losing season, a season that went terrible after the COVID shortened season, and then a really promising season. And I think what's really important for Kevin Willard and kind of the team is from an outside perspective, when you see a guy return for a fourth year, really an elite player, I think that kind of speaks volume to what Kevin Willard's building and a little bit of the culture. And I do think that coupled with the two transfers that we'll discuss later in the podcast, I think there's a really positive trajectory going on in College Park.
Yeah, and Reese will, in all likelihood, he'll be starting in the front court. We know that. Good chance he'll be starting alongside, or at least splitting some minutes with Derek Queen, obviously the five-star freshman that we've talked about on the show before. That'll be a particularly interesting, unit to see how Willard plays that. Now that you do have Reese coming back, see how you balance time with obviously a very highly touted freshman, but he is still a freshman, and Reese is a lot more established. So it will be interesting to keep a note as we see through the summer and as the preseason gets underway, to kind of hear what's going on in terms of how they're planning on maybe managing their minutes. I think them both being on the court at the same time would be an interesting proposition, but we know this team necessarily needs a lot of shooting, needs a lot more perimeter play. Packing it inside isn't necessarily gonna do the job like we saw this year. But let's talk about some of the additions that Maryland made, moving away from the return of Reese to some of the guys that will be joining Reese this year, probably in the starting lineup. And I think the number one person that we should start with is Maryland's most recent addition, at least as of recording this Thursday afternoon, is Jacobe Gillespie, the Belmont point guard who, in all likelihood, is going to start at point guard, kind of replace that Jameer Young role. And the similarities, we're not necessarily saying Jacobe Gillespie is going to be Jameer Young. Don't want to necessarily put that pressure on him, but the similarities are there. Jameer was a mid-major transfer coming from Charlotte, and Gillespie comes from Belmont, which is in the Missouri Valley Conference, which is a pretty solid conference. Usually one of the better mid-major conferences, and he was ranked as one of the better point guards available in the transfer portal. He averaged 17.2 points, 4.2 assists, and 3.8 rebounds this past season. Was an all-conference selection, one of the best defensive players in the conference. Andrew, just initial reaction and analysis of Gillespie's addition to this team, and potentially the Terps finding their point guard early on in this portal cycle.
Yeah, I think for me, when kind of researching how he's played in his first couple seasons, was his efficiency has been tremendous. I think that at the rim, his 2 point field goal percentage was over 65%. We're almost 65%. So he's been a really efficient player. And obviously, you mentioned with Jameer Young gone, Maryland needs a point guard who can really do everything. And Jacoby, it's not, we don't know how his game will translate to the Big Ten. Obviously, that's a huge jump from the MVC, but definitely to get a player who's ranked top 10 in the portal, I think that's a great get for Kevin Willard, especially so early in the cycle, and I think that will give them some really good momentum.
Yeah, and the fact that Reese coming back, that announcement was made
Yeah.
just right around the time that Gillespie made his his decision, his post on social media. One thing that came to mind immediately after watching a little bit of tape of Jacobe Gillespie, because you gotta scout out some of the new guys and see what you're working with. And the one thing that really stood out to me is his how effective he is on pick and rolls. And you mentioned his ability to finish near the rim. The fact that he's doing so at 6'1" at that high a level
Yeah.
really speaks volumes to his skill. Jameer Young was a similar size player who was we know his craftiness around the rim. I think that pick and roll with Julian Reese is going to be very, very key to this offense. That's a style of play that they really Jameer and Julian would really run all the time, and they found a ton of success with it, especially last year, not this past season. But I think most importantly for Gillespie in terms of his offensive game is his shooting ability. He shot over 38% from three this past
Oh my
season as a
goodness.
sophomore. I know, which is you can't believe that Maryland's getting a player that's a capable 3-point shooter, but he struggled a bit as a freshman, shooting the three, but really made a big jump this past year. His effective field goal percentage was one of the best marks in the country. A guy like that can space the floor. Maryland, one of their priorities and perhaps their utmost priority this season, this offseason, I should say, is bettering its shooting and making sure that it has a better ability to space the floor and have guys that can knock down outside shots. When you have the point guard that's able to stretch the floor a little bit, in addition to getting downhill and finishing near the rim, it adds a whole new dimension to your offense. And that's why I think a guy like Jacobe Gillespie is probably a perfect fit, at least considering the guys that were available in the portal for this team.
Yeah, and it's not just his offense. I think we should probably touch on his defense. He was one of the best players in the conference in forcing takeaways. I believe top three in steals, and all defensive player. And you know how much Willard appreciates that in his strong defensive system.
Yeah, yeah. Those active hands, you can see him just watching his game. He's always looking for a steal, looking to make a play there. And for a guy his size, that's definitely important to make sure you're able to get downhill. I guess let's move on to Rodney Rice as well, Maryland's other addition. He was from Virginia Tech, although he barely played at Virginia Tech. He was there for 2 years. Battled injury his first year, and then this past season, left the team in October. So never really got much of an opportunity to see how he plays at the college level. Very small sample size, but local kid, played high school at DeMatha, or at least finished high school at DeMatha. Former four-star recruit, very talented guy. Another guard that you look at possibly being able to space the floor a little bit. Don't necessarily know exactly what his role will be, whether he'll find his way into the starting lineup, whatever it may be. But Rodney Rice, another good addition for Maryland that has been busy here bolstering its backcourt. Now that you have Reese back, you don't have to worry that much about the front court. But really done a good job of kind of bolstering this starting front court and getting some good rotation players in there.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, Rodney Rice is going into his third year of college, and he's only played 8 total games, right? So I think he's a major unknown. But we know Maryland fans when they see a guy who was a top recruit, from the DMV, from the math that gets them excited. And I think he's shown potential. Obviously, he was one of the best players, in the DMV his senior year of high school. He showed, glimpses of potential in those 8 games he played his freshman year, but ultimately he is an unknown. And I wanted to touch on something you mentioned about the front court. I disagree a little bit. I do think that they need to bolster their depth a little bit with Reese and Queen, who were obviously
Well,
post play.
depth, I
Yeah,
agree with.
I,
I
I
meant
agree.
more the
I agree.
starting line.
Yeah, I agree that they definitely need some depth and maybe a stretch four, a stretch five player. But the portal, we have, there's over a month and a half, over a little over a month until it closes, and I don't think Kevin Willard is done. I think we're definitely gonna see a couple more moves for Maryland.
Yeah, and perhaps I should clarify. I meant more the starting front
Gotcha.
court as opposed to maybe the depth, because obviously there's a ton of problems in terms of bolstering the depth at
Yeah.
every position. But yeah, I mean, right now, speaking of how early it is in the portal cycle, I mean, we're recording this the first night of the Sweet 16 games, so you still got 16 teams in the NCAAs, you still got teams playing in the NIT elsewhere in the country. A lot of guys still mulling whether they're gonna enter the portal, go to the draft, stay at their current school, whatever it may be. So there's obviously going to be a lot of movement. We are very early in this portal cycle, but at least as it stands now, you can take a little bit of a victory lap that Maryland is number one in the 24/7 sports transfer portal rankings. That's partially because they're one of the only schools to have multiple commits already, but I think it just speaks to the sense of urgency that you're seeing from Kevin Willard. And he was challenged after this past season. A lot of people challenging him to say, this was a tough season, but we're going to give you a pass and see what you can do this offseason. And it looks like he's really hit the ground running. He's lived up to what he said about, really having to work hard to revamp this roster. And it's still early. They still got a lot of holes to fill, but I think you can be nothing but encouraged, at least with the start that we've seen from Willard and the staff, closing on some of these guys that seem like, they had an inside track on, but still you never know, especially with NIL. Being able to close on these guys, I think is really impressive.
No, and you chuckled a little bit, but I really do think it's really important for after in the really just 2 weeks after a really disappointing season, they're really gaining some momentum. I know you touched on NIL a little bit, and I know fans have been a little discouraged. Maybe we don't have the NIL to compete, but when you land a 5-star recruit, you bring back Julian Reese, you get two guys who are top 30 in the transfer rankings. The NIL is clearly there. Might be behind some of the top teams in the country, but it's clearly sufficient to build a pretty successful program. And kind of speaking on that momentum again, obviously the season we know how tough it was. We know the struggles, but I put this out on social media that on February 21st, Derek Queen, the 5-star commits. On March 9th, after the really poor loss to Penn State, Will came out and said, I messed up with constructing this roster. Less than 2 weeks later, he lands Rodney Rice. 3 days after that, he lands Gillespie, and Julian Reese announces he's returning for a fourth year. So it's been a really strong start to the offseason, and I don't think it's nearly done.
Yeah, and there's probably still some re-recruiting going on behind the scenes, with some of those other guys that we don't necessarily know if they're gonna stay or go. It's still early. We'll have more coverage as everything develops. Still waiting on some guys maybe to enter the portal as well that Maryland has their eye on, and we'll see as everything goes down. I guess that's about all of the news that we had to hit on. Andrew, anything else that you think we missed before we head out?
Do you want to give way too early predictions on what next year may look like?
As in a starting lineup or something along those lines?
Is it a starting lineup?
Sure. Yeah, I'll give a way too early prediction. I'll say Gillespie starts at point guard, and then I think Deshaun Harris-Smith is going to keep his spot in the starting lineup, and then I'll go Kaiser at the three, and then I'll put Reese and Queen filling out the front court there. I think Rice or Kaiser seem like the at least the early contenders to start. I think Jordan Geronimo, if he is to stick around, probably gets bumped down to a bench role, like you saw a little bit later in the year with Kaiser overtaking that spot. And obviously Dante Scott gone as well. So that would be my prediction for a starting five. I think, I don't know if there's too much wiggle room. I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Same thing.
Same thing. Yeah, I think that spot at the three there. I think you pretty much now that you have Gillespie, you have your backcourt more or less settled, and you have your front court, assuming Reese and Queen will be on the court together. I think there's a scenario where maybe they try and split minutes, but I'm assuming they're not bringing Julian Reese back with the promise that he's going to be splitting minutes with a freshman. So I'm just going to assume that they'll be on the court at the same time, and that'll be interesting to see. But you definitely got to have some shooting in there, which is why I like Kaiser, because we saw some improved shooting from him down the end of the year. Andrew, want to sign us off?
Sure. This will definitely not be the last. We'll be back on here talking about the transfer portal. But thank you again for listening.